Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we have Prosper, Tome-Bound, Group Hug slash Group Slug. This is a deck that aims to help and hurt your opponents in equal measure, and with a pretty strong commander to boot. This deck list comes to us by Astrohawk97, who says, have fun. We definitely will. As always, this deck list will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you go and take a look for yourself, see what kind of suggestions you might have, and maybe something you thought of that I didn't can go into the comments below. Also, while you're in the video description, if you wanted to submit your own deck for me to look at, there's a link right there. And if you would like to bring your deck to the front of the list to make it the next one I look at, there is a link to that as well. So who is Prosper Tome-Bound, and why are we trying to build them as a group hug slash slug deck? Prosper Tome-Bound is a 4-mana 1/4 in red and black with Tiefling Warlock with Death Touch. They have two abilities. Mystic Arcanum, at the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. And Pact Boon, whenever you play a card from exile, create a treasure token. So, Prosper is pretty much the poster child of just generically good in Rakdos. This commander is just so good. Just gives you card advantage and ramp all together at once. There's really not much to dislike. You can really go into his second ability by exiling bunches of cards and casting them and getting more treasure that way, but it's really unnecessary. He's just generically good. And I recognize the use of having a generically good commander in a deck that's trying to pull itself in multiple directions. So what are these directions? Well, we have a lot of cards like Harsh Mentor that hurt our opponents for doing things that they want to be doing, such as activating creatures, or Underworld Dreams for them drawing cards. We have some that hurt us as well, like Mana Barbs or Spiteful Visions, both of which ping us as well as our opponents. And then we have a collection of cards that actually help them, such as, let's see, some wheels that can be nice for them. There is an artifact's Tempting Contract, which gives them treasures. Knowledge Pool and Omen Machine allow players to change the way they play cards. It's a little tricky, but are both kind of more boons than, curses. And I think a few other cards that do different versions of these abilities. I will say one of the parts of the deck I can notice is it seems a little unfocused. It's trying to do two things that are opposite, and sometimes those things kind of clash together. For example, we can see we've got combos with Underworld Dreams and Spiteful Visions to deal damage on draws, but we then don't, we do have, Omen Machine that stops people from drawing cards, effectively making those cards useless, both the damage cards and the wheels that make people discard their hands and draw again. So there's definitely a pretty strong nombo there. I think what we need to do is kind of focus on the nombos, remove them, and adding a few cards here and there that are more, more useful more of the time, but can still equally pressure us and our opponents, so it still has that kind of group hug slug mentality. After all, if you're getting hit as fast as they are, no one's going to complain, right? So let's take a look at our curve. Our curve is kind of mainly chunked in the middle. I'd like it to be a little more even across, but it's not the worst thing. 2 and 3 mana cards are often where we find a lot of these effects, so it makes sense over there. But we'll notice that we have a lot of 4-drops. We have a total of 15 cards that are 4-drops, and we're going to take a bit of a look at them, because as we say oftentimes, these cards compete with our commander. Now, usually we talk about what that competition means, and in this deck it's a little different. The competition is not that these cards do the same things or require your commander. The competition is that Prosper is just a generically good card. And we just want Prosper out. Ideally, if we can ramp into Prosper, put Prosper out on turn 3, and just start flipping cards, we'll be very, very happy. We'll be getting ahead very quickly. However, that plan doesn't actually work with the group hug or slug plan, right? It doesn't actually group hug or slug our opponents in any way. So we're going to take a look and we're going to see which 4 drops we can remove and which ones we can be a little more critical on and figure out how to reduce this number so that there's less competition between these cards. So there's a few that come to mind right away. Looking at the artifacts is where I generally want to take my pick. Hedron Archive is just too much mana for a mana rock. 4 mana is just too much mana, and this deck isn't really ramping to 6, which is generally where you want to get to, or 7, from playing this at 4 mana and then playing a land and getting to 7. So I think this is an easy cut right here. Speaking of mana rocks, Nyx Lotus is equally kind of a strange inclusion here. Once again, there's a card that is made for devotion decks or monocolor decks, and though we do have a lot of permanents in our enchantments, we also have a lot of sorceries and instants, so we don't have as many pips as we could like. It's also a little interesting though, Underworld Dreams stands out as 3 black pips. A lot of the other cards seem to have red pips, so there's a bit of a back and forth here. So I also don't like Nyx Lotus. Tempting Contract allows for the beginning of your upkeep. Each opponent may create a treasure token, and each one who does, you get a treasure token. This is a particularly bad card. I've really wanted to play it, I've really wanted to try it, but it just does not work, unfortunately. Because, 1, 4 mana and you have to wait an entire turn for it to do anything. If this said at the beginning of your end step, I would probably be so much less harsh on this card, but it doesn't, and unfortunately, a whole turn cycle is too long. Then you might get a treasure out of it. It is very, very easy for your opponents to say no to this ability. And if they do, you get nothing from it. Once you play this card, someone just needs to say, oh, we're just going to agree not to get treasures, right? And if they agree, you've spent 4 mana to do nothing for the rest of the game. That's not ideal. In addition, to make Tempting Contract work, oftentimes you have to pressure your opponent's mana bases to force them to want to get that treasure. But here, they don't want the treasure, and you're not pressuring their mana bases. And frankly, even if you did, would they really, really want the treasure anyways? Like, or would you want to give them the treasure, I should say? Because if you've gotten them down on mana or on colors, well, you don't want to give them the mana. So it's a bit of a weird card. I don't particularly like it. So I would easily cut this as well. But before we go and look at the other 4 mana cards, I want to briefly say, take a look at these cards, right? And we're talking about mana. And let's look back here. You'll notice that we also are playing Rakdos Kirun and Rakdos Locket. A lot of our mana rocks are very high mana. I think we can very, very easily reduce them. We should be playing Rakdos Signet to begin with, Arcane Signet as another one, Rakdos Signet and Arcane Signet. And then we should play the Talisman, which is Indulgence, which is unfortunately, I believe, the most expensive talisman, but is still very, very much so worth it because it's just a strong card and it is lower in mana and lets you play Prosper on turn 3. In fact, after this, if you wanted to play more, you could play Mind Stone, which is it's 2 words, huh? It is the 2 mana version of Hedron Archive. It does the same thing, but as if there's only 1 copy. So I prefer this, it's lower mana. And then after that, the last one I would say would be Felwar Stone, which is also very strong, can tap for your colors at 2 mana. Those are the ones I would play first, and then there's others, but I think that's more than enough for the mana to get Prosper out early. Going back to our 4 mana cards, let's look at the other ones. Ley of Combustion is okay. It feels a little tricky here. It can either be really, really good or just okay. And the fact that it's free to play if it's in your opening hand is less relevant when you have 100 cards or 99 cards to draw from. That being said, I'll leave this up to you. For me, it's pushed by the fact that it's 4 mana, so I wouldn't want to play this because you have other 4 mana cards that are much better, and I think this is lower on the ranking, so I wouldn't mind cutting this. Mana Barbs is absolutely necessary in a deck like that. So much pressure, so good. Same with Spiteful Visions. I get why it's there, and I would like to keep it. War's Toll, likewise, is a really good card in a deck like this, but it gets worse when you give your opponents treasures, so I want to reiterate again that I do not want to give our opponents treasures if we can help it. After that, we have Night Dealings. This one's really, really interesting. I remember seeing a video recently that was talking about how strong this ability is. The fact that it is, recurable tutors or repeatable tutors for 4 mana each time. I really don't like it in this deck. I think there's some decks that can use this. I get this is really good at putting the counters onto it, on the theft counters onto Night Dealings, but you just don't have the mana to take the counters off. Like if you could produce like 12 mana, this would be really, really good. And that being said, you would still need to do the damage, like 12 mana, do some kind of group damage spell, and then start, drawing cards off of it or tutoring cards. It feels good, but you don't have the mana for it. Another way to use this card really powerfully is a deck that's really, really hard on flash or instant speed. So you have this outlet at any point in order to use your mana instead of just letting it go to waste. But you are also not that. So this feels really, really weird. It's a really slow card here, and I think you shouldn't play it. The ceiling is high, but not in a deck like this. Looking at our creatures are pretty good. Um, I would say I'd say keep them all. They're all pretty good. Extinction Event, I feel like if you want, you can turn it into a 5 mana spell. You might be a little happier with it. It's just at 4 mana. And the fact that it never hits everything is kind of frustrating. Whereas you could just find a 5 mana black destroy all creature spell or something more mana than that and you'll be happy. It's just the 4 mana we don't like. Price of Fame is 2 mana because it hits legendary creatures, namely our commanders. That's fine. And Wild Ricochet is not going to compete because you're not going to hold up the spell on the first time you have 4 mana. You're going to hold it up later. It's okay. I don't like the spell in the deck like this, but it is neat, so I'm not going to be too hard on it. All right, let's look at a few other cards here and there that I think kind of stick out to me. So Howling Golem feels like it could be really good, but you need to kind of work with your opponents. When you have a lot of cards that punish drawing, I like this more. So I want to keep this, but once again, this does mean we have to pull out the Omen Machine because it just makes this card absolutely useless. Looking down here, we have Kulrath Knight. This feels like a strange inclusion. Creatures with counters on it can't attack or block. This could be really, really good if you know your opponents really, really well. I just don't know who your opponents are, unfortunately. If there's a lot of +1/+1 counters in your play group, absolutely play this card. It's very, very funny. That being said, if there isn't, you don't really have ways to put counters onto creatures, so I wouldn't use this, but nonetheless, it's an interesting card, just not in this deck, so I would cut that. Red Elemental Blast also feels strange. It also feels super focused for this power level of deck. Do you have a lot of blue decks around? Then yes, this is fine to run. If you don't, this should just be Lightning Bolt. I think you'll just be much happier. Cruel Entertainment is another card that I've talked about before. It's just a bad card. I'll give you the shorter version of this. The short version is no matter how you use this card, it's not worth 7 mana. If you pick two players that aren't you, both players will both players can just choose to not use that turn against each other and use it against you. and that's just going to waste 7 mana. And they have, the intention to do so. It's not that you've helped one and hurt the other, it's you've hurt both. So they're incentivized to use that frustration at you and point it at you. So it's not ideally a good card that way. And the other way is that no matter which opponent you pick and yourself, they go last, so they have the most information because they'll take your next turn. And they go last, so they have the most information and can do the most things. And also, you are skipping your next turn to do this in exchange for getting a worse turn most of the time. There might be situations where you can use this to take the turn of the player that's about, like that's the strongest player. But then you can play something else like Worst Fears, I think, and you'll just be happier with it. This is just, this is clunky. It's not good. You're not going to have fun doing it. It's a really cool idea, but it doesn't work as intended. Allure of the Unknown is kind of bad. I think you would just want regular card draw, like for this kind of thing. Like you might just give them the wrong thing. This card is really strong when your deck has just such an even level of power that you don't mind giving a spell away. But like, what if you get a situation where you give them Terminate, right? They're going to take it and blow up your commander. I don't know. It doesn't feel good. I think just play Read the Bones or another draw effect to just get a bunch of cards in hand, and you'll be really happy. Don't get me wrong. I love the art here. I have a foil copy that I opened way back when, and I always thought, oh, this would be cool in a deck, but it's not. It's unfortunately just not cool, and it doesn't do what you want it to do. Anything else I want to point out? I think that's generally it. Let's go to some additions. Pendant of Prosperity. Yeah, that's fine. That's a good group hug deck. Okay, hold on. Scythe of the Red Shit doesn't belong here. You're not a combat deck, and you can't force blocks like this. And I don't think you can ping your opponents with these kind of cards, right? It hits players. Okay, yeah. So this card isn't. I guess Chandra's Incinerator is the combo, and yes, that's really really good together. But it's a lot of mana. It's like 12 mana to put together. I don't particularly like it. Okay, let's look at some additions that I want to put into the deck. First of all, you need some low mana cards, and Keterek Parasite is really, really good. Just another thing that punishes your opponents for drawing cards as long as you have a red permanent, your commander is red, and you have a lot of 2-drops that are red. You're pretty happy having this card out. It's also got really, really cool art. I do really like it, and it can represent quite a bit of damage by itself. So I do like that there. After this, a lot of my other suggestions are going to hurt everyone, but this one I wanted to do that hurts just an opponent. Actually, let's do the other one that hurts just an opponent. Is Loyal Subordinate. This is also just kind of a good card. It says it's a 3/1 menace that says as long as your commander is out, your opponents lose 3 life every one of your combats. This is just a really nice pressure card, and it curves into Prosper really, really nicely. I think this is just kind of free to play. Just put a little more pressure on your opponents. All right, let's get back to the group part of Group Hug Slug. And a lot of these are more punishing effects, but I think they're cards that your deck is kind of missing that you can put in rather nicely. And all of these punish you as well, so it still feels like you're part of the group. Zozu the Punisher deals 2 damage to a player every time they play a land. Very, very nice. And to be specific, I said play a land. It should be that a land enters the battlefield. So your opponents that are land-based decks or landfall decks are going to be really, really mad at this. But in the meantime, you take the damage too, so you can just shrug and say, "Hey, Zozu's kind of a jerk. I wish he didn't hurt us." What's the text? He causes lots of pain, and he can cause a lot of pain and do it with no fuss. That's all good. I just wish he wouldn't do it to us. What a poet, Cuckoo. Great card, absolutely play it. Likewise, Sulfuric Vortex deals 2 damage to each player on each upkeep. Well, oh my goodness. 2 damage to the player whose upkeep it is. And then no one can gain life. Nice and easy. It's a 3 mana, really good card. You'll be happy you play it. Let's go back into one that is Group Hug and Slug, which I was very surprised wasn't on your list, is Descent into Avernus. This is a card that on your upkeep, you put 2 counters on this. Then each player gets X treasure tokens and takes X damage, where X is the number of charge. What were they? Descent counters. Why can't they just be charge counters? It's the number of descent counters on this card. What does this mean? This means on each of your upkeeps, everyone makes 2 treasure and takes 2 damage per upkeep. So that first one is 2, the second one is 4 treasures, 4 damage, the next one is 6 treasures and 6 damage. This card is really, really good, really, really fun, and I think like if you're playing Group Hug Slug, this is the card that should be the poster child for your deck, right? Now, I want to have 2 more cards that are just more group hate again. I know that they don't have the hug element, but I think the hug element is a little easier because you can put in cards like Haunted Mind, which I should actually, let's put that in here. I always forget if it's Haunted or Hallowed, and I always feel like Howling is the one. Howling Mind, where each player draws an extra card per turn. Works really well with a lot of your cards, but generally it is a nice group hug deck. Like these group hug effects, Temple Bell is another one. They're easier to find. So what I want is something to, oh, I didn't write the bell. There we go. I want something to punish all the cards you're putting into people's hands. Bottomless Pit is a 3 mana enchantment that says on each player's upkeep, they discard a card at random. Because of how your commander works, that card that you've exiled cannot be hit by this, so therefore you will always have at least one quote unquote card in hand when you start your turn, which is really, really nice. Then this triggers, then you have your regular draw, and you have 2 cards in hand, even though Bottomless Pit wouldn't let you do that regularly. This is just a great card. It's really, really fun. The fact that they have no control over it is really, really strong. And this card works very, very well with Painful Quandary. And another card that always works with Painful Quandary really well that I like to suggest is Oppression. Oppression says whenever a player plays a spell, that player discards a card from their hand. This, once again, is a lot of pressure. Granted, at a certain point, this card doesn't do anything, but until that point, it's really, really good. It's really strong against any control deck or any deck that needs to keep cards in his hand, and any deck that just easily gets pressured out of resources, this card is going to be very, very good against. And as mentioned before, this card is so, so good with Painful Quandary. Very, very easily puts them into a position where they are taking 5 on every cast. And the final card I want to suggest is one that I just feel is missing, and it's Blasphemous Act. This card is just so good in these kinds of decks, and so good in red in general, that I think you'd be just really happy playing Blasphemous Act. It is also incredibly cheap for how many times it's been reprinted. So definitely play this card. I think the deck itself has a nice direction it's going into. I think definitely some cleaning up is in order. I think you'll notice that it works a lot smoother. Right now, it does feel like the deck is heavily leaning on Prosper because Prosper is just a really strong generic commander. And so if you were in a position that you played this deck and improved it and really started to enjoy the improvements, there might be a point that you might want to replace Prosper with a different commander. And it can even be one of the commanders from the deck. For example, Mogus is pretty straightforward to deal a generic amount of pressure. Now, is it better than Prosper? Absolutely not. Mogus is not that great. But it would be on theme. But I think the one I'd be much more inclined to suggest is Xantcha. Is if you put Xantcha at the front of a deck like this, it is both group Slug and group Hug. Hug because you're giving someone a 5/5, Slug because it is now beating the tar out of your other opponents, while those opponents are getting free draws and damage towards Xantcha's controller. I think it's also a really fun way to get your commander out really early in a deck like this, and then not have to really think about your commander anymore, and instead just focus on putting out the Hug and Slug. It also works, she works really, really well with all of the spiteful draw that you have, so that with Xantia out, your opponents are using Xantia's ability to draw cards, and that's going to damage them. And while they draw those cards, they're damaging the opponent that has Xantia. I don't like suggesting new commanders for decks because I think a lot of the fun of building a deck around a commander is exactly that. But for what it's worth, if you end up having a setup of this deck that you really enjoy, I think Xantia as your commander would be a lot better. And you can keep Prosper in the 99 and still benefit from the fact that he's a really, really strong commander, but also have a much more on-theme effect that is really probably going to help you drain out your opponents much, much faster. While we're here, I just realized one more of these kind of effects that it feels like we're missing is our 5-mana Omnixilis from War of the Spark, who says whenever an opponent draws a card, the Omnixilis deals 1 damage, and then when you destroy a creature with his ability, they draw 2 cards. I think this could be just another version of the effect that you'd be probably really, really happy to run. All right, I hope these suggestions have helped. I think this is a fun deck. I really do like its kind of mix of, hug and slug. It feels like it's almost a wheel deck, if you're familiar, like Nekusar and the like. So that's another direction you could go with the deck. But for now, I think the idea is very clearly here. And I think the idea is very, very fun. It's a different kind of red-black chaos that I enjoy seeing. And I'm sure your friends both like and dislike it when you bring it onto the table. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck or any deck, there is a link in the video description below. And if you want your deck to be the next deck I look at, there is a link to bring your deck to the front of the queue down there as well. If you could like, comment, subscribe, I'd be very, very grateful. Do the whole YouTube thing. It's great for the channel. And I hope to see Prosper or any other commander at this painful group hug deck again. I'm really excited to see what you do with this. Good luck.